All right, welcome back. So we've read some Kant. A little tricky, right? Hopefully you battled through the Kant, and then if you've read the Rachels and watched my lecture, hopefully the Kant sort of starts to come together and make sense for you, even if the language is a little tricky. He's a notoriously difficult author. So here is Christine Korsgaard. She's a prominent Kant scholar, and she's going to help us now sort of try to resolve some of the stuff that Kant really leaves ambiguous his writing and see if we can go beyond Kant and use what he starts and some basic logic and some interpretation and figure out if we can sort of help Kant out and make his theory a bit more complete. So she's dealing with the first version of the categorical imperative, right, which is shows up a few times in Kant's writings, often in slightly different formulations. One version is act according only to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should be a natural law. So sometimes he says natural law, sometimes he says law of nature, other times he says a system of nature of which you yourself were a part. Times he says what sort of world he would create under the guidance of practical reason. So these are all supposed to be in some way interchangeable. Uh, but what it seems he's getting at, as we figured out so far, and through the Rachels and through our discussion of it, is that the idea is that if you take some rule and you try to universalize it, an immoral rule will not be universalizable because you try to do it, you'll end up in some form of contradiction or some sort of incoherence or internal tension, right? You'll recall the idea of breaking a promise, right? Oh, I'm thinking about breaking this promise. What rule would I be following? It's okay to break promises whenever you want. And then imagine, okay, what if everybody did that? And we see, oh, well, there would be no point in promising. The whole practice of promising would go away because no one would believe him. What's the point? And then you get yourself in a situation where you're trying to promise when there's no promising, and there's some kind of contradiction there. At least that seems to be the idea. But exactly what sort of contradiction is involved is actually kind of tricky to interpret. So Hunt says other things in other spots that suggest at least sort of three distinct interpretations of what he means. And he doesn't really give us enough to tell us which of these three is the right one. So it's sort of up to us and, Christine Korsgaard to use our own, reasoning skills to try to figure out which one could work, right? Um, and we'll find that certain interpretations work with some examples, right? So, the idea is we would like Kant's categorical imperative to make murder wrong, right? Any hopefully any ethical theory sort of that's worthwhile is going to say, yeah, murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, and there's some other stuff where we know Kant thinks, for example, lying is always wrong, right? So it should work out that his categorical imperative makes lying wrong. So we're going to go through these three interpretations, and Korsgaard's going to argue for one of them and say that it's the best one overall. So here are the three interpretations, and then we'll go through each one in more detail. So we've got the logical contradiction interpretation, the teleological contradiction interpretation, and the practical contradiction interpretation. So let's start with the first, the logical contradiction interpretation. The idea here is that universalizing an immoral maxim, right, like it's okay to break a promise whenever you want to, would create a logical contradiction. So logical contradictions are like literally saying, you know, um, this is an egg and this is not an egg, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, right? It's like P and not P. It's like a literal contradiction, like a proposition and the negation of that proposition. So those are literally metaphysically impossible, right? Something can't both be one way and also not be that the very same way at the same time, right? 2 plus 2 is equal 4, either 4 or it's not 4, right? It can't somehow be both, right? So maybe the idea is when you're trying to imagine, right, universalizing this maxim, it's actually inconceivable because it's some literal contradiction. That's one interpretation. We'll explore that and see how well it works. Another interpretation, teleological contradiction. So teleology is sort of a Greek root. What it means is like goal or purpose, right? So on this interpretation, universalizing an immoral maxim would end up contradicting the purpose that that maxim is meant to accomplish, or contradict some other purpose of nature. And then we have the practical contradiction interpretation, which means if I universalize this maxim, I wouldn't get to do the thing I'm trying to do. We'll get into more details of those. I'm just introducing them. So let's start with the logical contradiction interpretation. Um, certain examples work great with this interpretation. The breaking promises one, for example, right? So we've been through it many times, right? But the idea is that, okay, if everybody follows the maxim, it's okay to break a promise. If it benefits you, then no one believes promises and promises go extinct, right? But we still need to find, right, an actual like proposition and its negation, right, to make it a logical contradiction. It would have to be something like, when I universalize this maxim, it's okay to break promises. I'm imagining a world where I make a promise, but I'm also imagining a world where I don't make a promise because in that world there's no promises, right? Where again, where it's universalized. So there is, right? We can understand this as like, yeah, there is a logical interpretation. I'm trying to imagine a world where I make a promise and I don't make a promise. So that seems to conceivably work for promising, right? But there's lots of other sorts of things that we would think should be immoral, right? That if the categorical imperative is doing its job, it should entail that these things are immoral, and we think that Kant would think they're immoral. Um, but it's hard to generate a logical contradiction. So, for example, Korsgaard considers an example that was uh, put forth by a different philosopher, Dietrichson, and she sort of modifies it, and then I kind of modify it again. But she says, suppose I decide I want to kill my baby because it cries too much, right? So I ask myself, what maxim would I be following? It'd be something like, it's okay to kill babies that cry more than average. Um, suppose right, let's universalize it. What if everybody did that? That doesn't seem to be a contradiction according to Korsgaard, right? We could conceive a world where everybody kills babies that cry too much, right? Now, I think actually by using the more than average thing, she might be generating a contradiction, right? Because the more babies you kill, you start to drag the average down to zero, right? And maybe you do have a contradiction when there's like no babies or something, but that's not important that she uses the term average, right? So let's reformulate it and say, my maxim is it's okay to kill babies that cry more than 10 times a day. Okay, that world is conceivable. Sounds like a terrible world, right? But if every baby that killed more than 10 cried more than 10 times a day was killed, there's no contradiction. That world could happen, right? It would just be a mean world. But again, Kant's point isn't that um, if the maxim was universalized, that would be a bad world or a sucky world. Remember, Kant doesn't care about consequences, right? He cares about reason and rationality. So we need it to be literally an inconceivable world. And, the world where you kill babies that cry a lot seems perfectly conceivable. So, well, that's immoral, though, right? It should end up immoral to kill your baby for crying too much. So, if logical contradiction interpretation can't make killing babies immoral, then there's a problem with that interpretation. So here, Korsgaard wants to point out an important distinction that she thinks explains the difference between some of these interpretations of the categorical imperative. Promising, breaking promises, uh, promising is a convention, right? And it relies on people sort of making a tacit agreement and following certain rules. And what happens is when everybody decides to break the rules governing, for example, promising, the whole convention goes away, right? So that's why it makes sense to say, well, if I universalize breaking a promise, then there's not any promises anymore, right? The existence of promises relies on this convention of people more or less keeping the promise. Similarly with like lying, right? Um, if I right, so maybe I think I can get out of, some sticky situation by lying. I ask myself, well, what maxim would I be following? It's okay to lie, right, to get out of a tough situation. And then I ask myself, well, would I want that universalized, right? Could I universalize that? Well, if everybody's lying sort of whenever they want, now all of a sudden we can't really believe anything anyone says. And now all of a sudden communication starts to break down. Certainly the practice of lying sort of becomes pointless because the point of lying is you're hoping the person will believe you. But if everybody lies all the time, then nobody believes anybody. And so, like promising, this whole convention of lying and communication in general will break down. So, in that case, it does seem that can't universalize everyone lies all the time, right? So that means that lying is also immoral, according to the logical contradiction. Convention, like promising. Logical contradiction interpretation doesn't work. It works great for conventional acts, but not so great for what we call natural acts. So natural acts don't require sort of general agreement by all people. And so universalizing them doesn't create a contradiction. Um, So an example, sorry, I thought it was on the next slide. An example of a natural act, murder, right? Um, so killing can happen whether or not there's any sort of convention or general agreement by humans on what constitutes killing or whatever, right? That's just animals can kill each other, right? There's no conventions about it. So the tricky thing is to figure out how to make the categorical imperative make natural acts like murder immoral as well, right? Or like killing babies that cry too much. Right? That's a natural act. It's not a conventional act, and so it seems like maybe we need another interpretation because we would like killing babies to be. So Korsgaard pauses here to discuss a nearby example that was presented by Hegel. Hegel was a philosopher in the 1800s. Um, and she just wants to point out that her objection is different than Hegel's. She actually doesn't think Hegel's is like um, is that big a deal, right? Hegel says, well, look, the logical contradiction interpretation can't be right because he thinks it's too broad. So, um, for example, suppose I'm thinking about stealing, right? Um, that would create a contradiction if I tried to universalize it, because if everyone steals all the time, right? If anyone could steal whatever they want, then really in the end, there's no such thing as property. What's the point of owning anything if somebody will just take it from you any second, right? Really, the practice, the convention of private property breaks down. Now, if there's no property, there's no stealing anymore. So it's like promising and lying. Hegel argues for other examples. The logical contradiction is going to make things that we would think are good immoral, right? So, for example, Hegel says, what about if I see someone in need and I give them $10, right? That seems like a perfectly moral thing. But Hegel argues, well, ask yourself, what maxim would you be following? And I say, oh, I guess I'm following the maxim, help the poor whenever you can, right? Something like that. Always help the poor, right? Um, Hegel says, aha, if you universalize that and everybody helps the poor all the time, there's not going to be any poor left. So you've just created a contradiction. Right? You're imagining a world where you help the poor, but you don't help the poor because there are no poor, and therefore helping the poor is immoral, right? According to the categorical imperative, or at least the logical contradiction interpretation. And that seems wrong because helping the poor is a moral thing, right? We don't want the categorical imperative to make helping the poor immoral. Korsgaard, so that's Hegel's problem with the logical contradiction. Korsgaard says, I'm not so worried about Hegel's objection, right? It all depends on how you formulate the maxim, right? So if you just say help those in need, um, then you don't end up with a contradiction, right? Because if no one so suppose we universalize it, everybody helps people who need it until there's a point where nobody needs it. Okay, well that's not a contradiction, right? Everybody who needs it, but if nobody needs it, then don't, right? So it all depends, Korsgaard thinks, on how you formulate the maxim. So she's not too worried about Hegel's um, problem with logical interpretation of the categorical imperative, but she does think that her distinction is the one that matters, right? These natural acts that the logical contradiction interpretation can't make immoral. It doesn't make killing immoral, right? Because killing is a convention. Okay, so let's set aside the logical contradiction interpretation for now. Seems to work great for making stealing immoral, right? For making lying immoral, for making breaking promises immoral, but it can't seem to make killing babies immoral. So let's try some other interpretations and see if any of those can do any better. So the next one is the teleological contradiction. Remember, a teleology is a purpose, right? So Korsgaard, the teleological contradiction would be something like, right, doing this thing contradicts some uh, purpose, right, in nature or something like that, and it's wrong if it contradicts the way of nature, right, or something like that. So Korsgaard kind of breaks this one down in two possible interpretations. There's a couple ways you could think about a teleological contradiction. The first one she calls the simple view, which is something like, um, well, if your proposed action is against nature in some way, then it's immoral, right? So, for example, Kant thinks that suicide is immoral. Well, if you think that the natural purpose of a human is to live and thrive, right, and this is what nature wants for us, then yeah, we could see, okay, maybe killing yourself is against nature. Um, I mean, that's nice and simple. The problem is it doesn't really sound like what Kant's talking about, because remember, Kant thinks that you're supposed to take a maxim, right? I'm thinking of killing myself. What maxim would I be following? Then I try to universalize it, and I try to see if it generates a contradiction. So this simple interpretation of the teleological contradiction isn't really doing any of that. It's just asking, is your action against nature? So let's see if there's a version of the teleological contradiction interpretation that sounds more like. So the other version of this interpretation would involve universalization. It'd be something like this. Ask yourself whether a system of nature that universalized the impulse to kill yourself could sustain itself. And that seems like obviously the answer is no, right? So that would make suicide immoral, right? I ask myself, oh, I want to kill myself, and I ask myself, well, could everyone kill themselves all the time? Would the universe, right? Would our sort of ecosystem, right, continue to exist? And it seems like no, right? Every animal killed itself, and the ecosystem would collapse. So maybe that's the interpretation, right? It does seem to make suicide immoral in a sense, right? Um, One nice thing about the teleological contradiction is that it makes sense of why natural actions can be immoral, right? Killing yourself is a natural action; it's not a conventional action. Um, if you universalize it, the right the earth will break down, or right the natural system will break down. And it works for some of the conventional actions as well. So if you universalize lying, then any system that required sort of social creatures and communication and cooperation is going to break down, right? So it seems to be counter to the natural purpose of uh, human society, the types of beings we are. Um, it seems like it would make killing babies immoral as well. It's incompatible with a system that wants to perpetuate a system where everybody killed their babies. Uh, yeah, also seems like it would break down. Or even if you know everybody killed babies that cried too much, that's still a real drag on the ecosystem. Right? That's a lot of babies. So yeah, it seems to work a bit better than the logical contradiction interpretation, but there's still. So again, recall that the idea with the categorical imperative is the person thinking about doing the action is saying, what maxim am I using, and can I make that universal? Right? And I will it without contradiction. And so by stepping into like the idea of like, oh, is the natural system going to kind of break down if everybody does this? That's not exactly what's at stake according to the categorical imperative with the issue of suicide, right? So somebody's thinking about committing suicide and they're asking themselves, um, could I will a universe where everybody kills themselves? And they might very well say yes, right? Someone who's very depressed and contemplating suicide might not care if the whole world is destroyed, right? So even if it would destroy the whole natural ecosystem if it was universalized from the viewpoint of the person, right, asking the question, to them, it's no problem if the whole ecosystem breaks down and everybody dies, right? Kant would have to make it somehow irrational to not care if the whole world is destroyed. And it's maybe mean or perverse, right? But it's not clearly irrational, right? Or about anybody else, whether um, so I don't know. I mean, I think there's room possibly for a paper topic here, right? It's a little tricky. Kant's tricky, but I have had some good papers on Kant. Feel free to talk to me more if this interests you. The teleological interpretation seemed to do well, seemed to do better than the logical contradiction interpretation, but it didn't really seem to make suicide immoral, right? Okay, and now we have the third interpretation, right? So maybe this does better than the other two. So on the practical contradiction interpretation, um, what how this works is it's not that there's some sort of logical contradiction, like where I'm claiming two opposite propositions or contradictory propositions are both true. It's not that all of nature is going to break down. The idea is if I universalize my maxim, like I'm going to break this promise, and everybody does it, I'm not going to get what I want anymore. Right? So remember in the breaking a promise example, the idea was, oh, by breaking my promise, I'll get my friend to lend me the $100, right? But I won't have to pay him back. Well, imagine a world where everybody breaks promises all the time. I'm never going to get that $100 in the first place, right? My friend's not going to believe my promise, and then so I don't get what I want. My practical goal is thwarted. So that's the idea of the practical contradiction. Um, so how is this even a contradiction? You might ask, right? Well, it kind of makes sense as a contradiction if you think about the way Kant about action and willing. But Kant says that to will in action, right, is to see yourself as the cause of some outcome, right? So the categorical imperative then on this practical contradiction interpretation says an immoral action is one that if you universalized it wouldn't produce the outcome. So you'd be willing yourself to cause an outcome that can't happen. It would be like willing yourself to fly, right? Well, you can't really will yourself to fly. You can't will something that's impossible, right? So on this practical contradiction interpretation, it really is a contradiction, right? Um, because you're willing yourself again to break a promise for money, but by universalizing it, you're making it impossible to get money by breaking a promise. And so you're willing something that's impossible. It's like, quote, willing yourself to fly, which is really. So again, it makes sense of like a lot of the other cases that we've seen. It makes, again, breaking promises immoral, right? Not because it's incoherent, but because you won't get the money, right? If you universalized breaking promises. It gets around the Hegelian objection, right? So the goal in helping the poor is to eliminate poverty. So if everybody helps, you universalize it, everybody helps the poor, and then poverty goes away, great, right? Your purpose was actually fulfilled, right? You're not thwarted at all. And we can deal with natural actions too in many situations, right? So, for example, suppose I want to kill someone, for some purpose, right? Usually kill for fun, serial killer. There's a competitor for a job, and I want to kill them so that I can get the job. Well, now imagine what happens if we universalize the maxim I'm operating under, which is something like kill competitors for a job. Uh, well, in a world where that's universalized, what do you think is going to happen to me, right? I'm going to get killed by somebody. I'm not going to get the job either, right? Because I'm dead. So it seems like maybe you can make natural actions immoral as well, right? Because practical. The problem with so Korsgaard doesn't think any of these interpretations cover everything, right? There's still holes left out there. And the problem with the practical contradiction interpretation is it doesn't seem to work for suicide, right? So willing the maxim, it's okay to kill yourself, to be universal wouldn't thwart your goal, which is to die. So um, sure, everybody else dies, but I can still die too. It doesn't stop me from dying. Korsgaard just says, yeah, she doesn't think any interpretation is going to cover all of them, right? This is, you know, Kant. She hasn't solved Kant, right? Kant's still tricky, right? Out how his system could work, right? Um, and it also doesn't work that well in cases where you have to deal with other people's evil, like lying to save someone's life, right? Um, so she thinks the practical interpretation however, does capture, a broad class of actions that we think are immoral, which is trying to make yourself an exception for some personal gain. And the idea is you're asking yourself, well, would I really want everyone to do this? Well, if everybody did it, I wouldn't get the little thing I would get by cheating, right? Um, so this impulse that people we have sometimes to like, oh, I'm gonna sort of like, right, I'm gonna cheat, I'm gonna lie, I'm gonna do something that's sort of outside what other people do, so I can get a little something for myself. You should ask yourself, hey, what would happen if everybody did it? Well, you wouldn't get the thing you want. That means it's immoral, right? So, again, she's not solving it, and that's why I think that this Korsgaard paper leaves it open, like, a lot of interesting territory for folks to write papers if they want. Kant is there's people who spend their whole careers writing about Kant. Lots of opportunities there. So, um, I know this is kind of, again, this is sort of can be tricky stuff. So feel free to reach out to me or come to office hours if you're not quite understanding what's going on here. And again, you know, there might be a question on a quiz. There might be one option on the final to write about this, but uh, if this Kant stuff, this Korsgaard stuff is not for you, and you're much more interested in utilitarianism, that's fine too. Fall in love with and master every detail of each of these. I'm sort of giving you a menu of options, but you are one and master it for your paper. So if you think that this one is that one for you, yeah, reach out to me. Let's explore it.